Up, everybody? Welcome back to U.S. history class. Okay, we for quarter four we have like really two different pages of notes that are going, and we're going through history in a chronological fashion, kind of picking up after World War II. But we're looking at foreign policy things and domestic policy things. Foreign policy is like the Cold War unit, so you should have a page of notes going there where we talked about the division of Germany and the Berlin airlift, and then we've also been hitting some civil rights stuff, which is like the domestic policy. What's going on where racial tensions are kind of bubbling up inside the United States at that same period of time. Well, for the next few days, we are going to hit a hot war that takes place inside the Cold War. Remember, the Cold War is just like it's a 50-year chunk of time where tensions are really high between America and the Soviet Union. Now, World War III never breaks out. There's never a massive conflict between those two big superpowers, but in that 50-year chunk of time, there's going to be quite a few little hot wars that are regional conflicts that will tie into the unit. So the Korean War is a great example of a smaller scale hot war that takes place within the Cold War era. These notes would definitely go into the Cold War unit, obviously. So I would get those out, or if you haven't started taking notes yet, now would be a good time to start. And I would add in, like, in World War II, I spent a ton of time covering that big conflict because there were major global ramifications, and that's such a huge scale conflict, the biggest war in human history. I can justify spending more time on it. Now, this is not to like marginalize the sacrifice that so many American and other Allied soldiers made in trying to defend South Korea, but I just don't have enough time to really cover this war in depth. And also, I don't spend quite as much time on the Korean War because it doesn't have worldwide ramifications. It kind of sets the tone early in the Cold War era that America is saying we're not going to be pushed around, and essentially the Soviets or the Reds, the communists, kind of say the same thing. But it really doesn't have a huge impact outside of kind of the Orient and East Asia. Anyway, though, enough of me babbling and kind of laying the groundwork there. Now I want you to get your Cold War notes out, if you are taking any, and put in a heading that says the Korean War. And I would add in, I didn't put the date here, but I'd like you to right next to it put from 1950 to 1953. It's about a 3.5 year long conflict. So it all kicks off about 5 years after World War II. So in 1950, that's our starting date. All right. The end of World War II, it kind of lays the groundwork for how this whole conflict gets going, essentially. Now, know that, Korea had always been a unified country. There is only one Korean language. They kind of have one unified culture. It's very distinct from China, or from Chinese, culture and their language, and Japan. They're their own unique place. But they had always also been unified. The whole peninsula, essentially, before Japan had invaded it, was one unified country. All right. Now, at the end of World War II, everybody expected that the United States and probably the Soviet Union were both going to do a conventional invasion of Japan. Of course, that's not the way the war ends up. You have America using atomic weapons and bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that ends the war kind of in an unexpected and very abrupt manner. But at that time, Japan was definitely on its way to defeat. However, the whole Japanese empire had not totally unraveled and crumbled at that point. The Japanese army actually still controlled huge chunks of China and the whole Korean peninsula in 1945 when the atomic bombs are dropped. So then, when Japan does officially surrender, there is a mad scramble by all of the Allied countries, so the Soviets and the Americans and British, to go accept the surrender of Japanese soldiers. And by doing that, they're able to kind of like claim little chunks of territory. Well, the Russian army, and you can see on this map here, that actually Korea and or today it would be just North Korea, but Korea and Russia, or it was the Soviet Union at the time, do have a small little sliver of a border. Now, mostly Korea borders China, but there is a little bit of a border there with the Russians. So Stalin immediately gives the order to send in the Red Army, the Russian army, to come in and accept the surrender of Japanese troops in the northern part of the peninsula. The American Navy and Marine Corps come up, and actually Japan, it's not really on the map, but it's kind of where my head is at. We send soldiers up to Korea and land in the southern part of the peninsula, and we accept the surrender of the Japanese in the southern part of the peninsula. Well, after that happens, the plan was kind of that Korea would get unified and be an independent country again. But neither side really wants to totally like give up power. Both sides kind of leave their armies there and establish a government that looks like kind of how we'd want it to look. So in South Korea, you get a republic, a democracy that is kind of running the show under the supervision of America, the southern part of the peninsula. Stalin obviously sets up a communist-like dictatorship in the northern part of the peninsula, and they're going to kind of take their marching orders from Stalin and the Soviets, the more powerful communist country. And neither side really ever leaves, even though the plan had always been kind of informally to unify Korea again and let it be independent, but neither side wants to give up its influence. That makes sense? And Korea, roughly, like another important part that I'd want you to have for this is Korea gets divided at the 38th parallel. Parallels are like imaginary lines that run around the globe, like straight lines. Now, that's not the exact border. Roughly, the divide between North and South Korea is at the 38th parallel, which is that red dash line you see right there. All right. So now internally in America, if you go right after World War II, there's a lot of pressure that, man, the Soviets are kind of like the new Nazis. They're the new big threat out there, and people are really scared and don't want to lose more countries and territory to the communists. In 1949, we had already covered this, so about a year before the Korean War breaks out, China, a massive country, a quarter of the world's population, just kind of in the blink of an eye, it seems like, goes over to the communist side. That's a huge blow to President Truman. It kind of makes him look weak on communism. It's a huge blow to America too. And remember, our policy was containment, that we're not going to go in and actively like invade communist territories and like liberate them or make them become republics like us. But President Truman was very clear when he gave the Truman Doctrine speech to Congress that America is going to take a leadership role in the world, and we are going to do all we can to resist the spread of communism. We're going to contain it where it's at, and we will go and fight. We will use the American military if we feel like free territories are being threatened by the communist regime and the Soviets. So I put in here the Reds, that we're not going to lose any more territory or any more nations to the Reds. No, anytime I use that slang or you see it in class when we're talking about the Reds in U.S. history class, that means that it's like slang for the communists, okay? Now, another thing that I should emphasize, both sides in Korea, the northern government and the southern government, wanted to reunify the Korean peninsula, but neither side wants to give up power. So, like, Kim Jong-il, who you're probably familiar with today, it was actually his grandfather, Kim Jong-sun, who was the dictator in North Korea. He wants a unified communist government, and he wants to control the whole Korean peninsula. Now, I'm not sure who the president was in the southern part of Korea, but South Korea, they want a unified Korea too. They just want to have a democracy where they're going to elect their leadership, okay? Neither side wants to give up power. Now I'm going to kind of pause this video here for a quick second, and where it's going to pick up, I'm going to go to the whiteboard in my class, and I want to give you the rundown of kind of events of how the whole war unfolds. So here we go. Both sides in the Korean conflict wanted to have a unified Korea, but there was about a 5-year icy standoff from the end of World War II on until 1950 when this conflict breaks out, where it was just an uneasy tension, kind of a mini Cold War happening on the Korean peninsula. Well, the North Koreans, the communist part of Korea, ends up deciding to act first. Now, I did a little whiteboard drawing here behind you where I'm giving you all the different parts of it. And we're not going through and covering the Korean War like battle by battle, but most of the action in the war took place in the first about year and a half, okay? So in 1950, kind of key dates for you, 1950 to 53 is when this conflict plays out. North Korea invades South Korea across that 38th parallel line. So part one of the Korean War is the North Korean communists, the Red Army, which I have the red right there, invades the South and pushes them down to the city of Pusan, where they're down at this little tiny tip of the peninsula and about to be overrun. The South Korean government freaks out and they're asking for help. They actually send an ambassador to the United Nations and say, hey, this was an unprovoked attack, which that was true. We got invaded for no reason and we need help from the world. Well, America, remember, had the policy of containment. We weren't going and invading communist territories trying to free them, but we would go fight if the communists were invading places and trying to convert them over to the communist side, the dark side, kind of, sort of. So America goes to the UN, and we think Stalin and the Soviet Union are behind this attack. There's a big meeting at the UN, an emergency meeting is called, where essentially it's universally condemned that the North Koreans were the aggressors, that's an illegal war, and they shouldn't have done it. Now, a coalition army is going to get formed where 16 countries are going to send troops to go defend South Korea. But America is the leader of the coalition. Of the whole coalition army coming in, even though a lot of countries are represented, 80% of the soldiers are American soldiers coming in. Also, to make it look even more suspicious, when that emergency meeting at the UN happened, the Russians boycotted it. Stalin did not send an ambassador there to defend them. So that made it look even more suspicious, like they were definitely behind this attack. We thought that Kim Jong-un, who is the grandfather of the current North Korean dictator, we thought that Stalin told him to invade and the Russians were supporting them, and America was not going to stand for that. Now, we come to years later, we end up finding out that actually Stalin was not behind it. He didn't know this was going to happen. Now, I'm sure he was okay with it, but the Russians actually were not behind this attack, but it sure seemed like they were at the time. So the first part of the war is all the communist victories. They almost overrun and unify the whole Korean peninsula. Just in the nick of time, this is kind of part two of the war, America lands an army at Pusan to reinforce the South Korean government that was holding on. And we come up to, there's a city here called Incheon, where we invade halfway up the peninsula and we cut across and cut the supply lines of the communist army. So then the war totally tips. It's like a teeter-totter and goes back in the other direction. And America and the South Koreans and the coalition army push the North Koreans back up to the Yalu River, which that is the border, the Yalu River, Y-A-L-U, between China and the Korean peninsula. Well, that makes China very, very nervous. Remember, China had gone communist a year before. They knew that America was not happy about that. A quarter of the world's population just went over to the Soviet Union team. That makes China super duper nervous. And they're worried that, hey, if the Americans, why are they going to stop right there? Maybe the American army will come right into China and then try to win China over, back over to our side. So China gets involved in the fight. Now, China of 1950, 1951 is nothing like China today. It's a very backwards, agrarian society. They don't have nuclear weapons yet. They don't have a great air force or bomber planes. Their military is not highly trained like the American army, but the one thing that they do have that's their advantage, they have a lot of people. So kind of like how the Soviets under Stalin fought the Germans in World War II, where they end up winning out and pushing the Germans back, but they lost 10 times more soldiers. Stalin fought that war by just throwing waves and waves of Russian soldiers at the German army. The Chinese kind of have the same tactic. They sacrifice and take super heavy casualties, but where America only had a couple 100,000 soldiers there, China ends up sending 3 million soldiers into action. So they overwhelm us with numbers, and they start to push us back down the peninsula. And here you get part three, where the Chinese and North Koreans working together essentially push the American coalition army back down, and everything kind of wraps up about where it all started. Where, at the beginning of the war, it was roughly divided at the 38th parallel. By the end of the war, when things kind of settle down, you're back at the 38th parallel, and it's almost the exact same borderline as to where it started. So this war is totally it's a teeter-totter. It goes one direction, then the other direction, and then it balances back out. Now, there was a kind of a controversy. We talked about using nukes and going in and just going all in this war, but President Truman felt like we satisfied our policy of containment. As long as South Korea was going to remain intact, he was good with that. So really, like the last 2 years of the Korean War are just kind of a stalemate where there's still a little fighting going on, but neither side really gets any traction. It goes back to kind of like how we talked about in World War I with the trenches, like a stalemate where both sides are looking at each other across the line, and not a whole lot of action is taking place. So the final results page for the Korean War, the last kind of crucial or important things that I'd want you to add into this chunk of notes and that might appear on an upcoming quiz or eventually the exam. Bloody war, not nearly on the scale of World War II or even like the Vietnam War, where it's right around the corner. 37,000 American soldiers die. Many more, Korean people die and Chinese soldiers. But America pays a pretty heavy toll in this conflict. Most of the fighting in the war, the whole teeter-totter and back and forth, takes place in 1950 and 51. And then by 52 and 53, tensions are still high. The war is still going on, but things are stabilized around the 38th parallel again, where both sides just can't really make any headway. Now, General MacArthur, who I have pictured here with the corncob pipe, he was one of our top generals during World War II. He ran things in the Pacific, and he is going to be he's the main guy that is running the whole like coalition war effort, where America is 80% of that army, but like 16 other countries fought alongside us. He is the top Allied commander for the Korean War, and he was also our top Allied commander in World War II out in the Pacific theater of the war fighting the Japanese. He's quite a character. He's a guy I would like to actually profile someday. I don't think I'll get to it this year, but very interesting guy, a larger-than-life personality. He also has a really big ego. He thinks he's like the top dog. Well, President Truman essentially had said that, we don't want to make this World War III. We don't want to get the Russians involved. We don't want to go and invade China. MacArthur totally disagreed with them. Now, the president is the commander in chief of the military, so technically all the generals, they should listen to what the president says. Well, MacArthur and Truman did not like each other. MacArthur wants to use nuclear weapons again, like how when we ended World War II. He wants to use nukes, and he wants to retaliate against the North Koreans and the Chinese. He essentially was in favor of going in and just kind of waxing them and starting to drop atomic bombs and go in and flip China back over to like America's side. Truman is a little bit reluctant to do that because think he does not want a World War III. He doesn't want a global conflict again. And he's worried that if we start dropping bombs, if we start dropping nukes over there, that now Russia has developed nuclear weapons as well. He's worried that it'll escalate. And then Russia will start retaliating against maybe not America, but against other American allied targets. Like maybe they would go bomb West Berlin or Paris or London, and then the whole conflict would just spiral, out of control. So Truman is very clear, and he says, you know what? At this point in the war, we have protected South Korea. It's still going to be on our side. We have defended that country. We basically, it's kind of like where the dust settles. It's like everything was before the war started in the first place, where you have a North and a South Korea with two separate governments, a communist regime and a republic. Truman says, I'm satisfied with that. We have fulfilled the American, policy of containment, and we haven't lost more turf to the communists. MacArthur doesn't want to hear that, and he goes behind Truman's back and starts talking to members of Congress. He essentially very much undermines the president, and he wants to escalate this war more. Truman finds out about it, and actually he cans MacArthur. He fires him, and his career is essentially over. So Truman kind of pulls rank on him and says, don't cross me like that. I gave you your orders. You're a general. You go carry out the orders. It's not your job to question the president. So anyway, this war could have definitely escalated to a whole nother level. We could be covering this in a very different way if a guy like Truman had not been president. Now, who knows if the world would be better off or worse off today if MacArthur had his way and the war had escalated. Today tensions are very high still between North Korea and China and America. So maybe we would have a better world. Maybe things would have gone totally off the rails and we would have had a nuclear conflict and we wouldn't even be having history class here today. It's hard to say because you're playing the what if game there. But anyway, that's the way it did all kind of wrap up. From this time on, America is seen as a global superpower that is defending the world against communism. So military spending permanently goes up. Like if you went back to World War One, in between World War One and World War Two, America kind of went back to isolationism. We just kind of were minding our own business and worrying about American problems. But then after you have an kind of just under a decade chunk of time, World War II happened, where we're fighting the Japanese and the Nazis, and then bam, we have another armed conflict with communist forces over in Korea. From that time on, it was seen as like it's imperative that America, if it's going to be in a leadership role in the world, we have to have the strongest, the best military. So from that time on, on through to today, America spends more money on its military really than any other country in the world, and probably more than any other country in history. Anyway, this is also the first war. One more notable thing that kind of crosses over to our civil rights unit. This is the first war in American history where the U.S. military is unsegregated or it becomes integrated. So really, like remember World War II, you still had isolated units for black soldiers, and there were like squadrons like the Tuskegee Airmen that were all black fighter pilot squadrons that were trying to prove that they could fly as good as white pilots. Well, by the time the Korean War happens on through to today, you have that policy of integration in the U.S. military where black soldiers, white soldiers, really any soldiers of any race are all kind of on equal standing and all serve together mixed in the same units. Okay, that's all I have for you for the Korean War. We're going to hit a couple more lessons that'll tie into the whole situation in Korea. Hopefully that all made sense to you, but if you have any questions, by all means, contact me.